The Middle Ages, fact versus myth. The Middle Ages are often seen as a dark and backward period, full of illiteracy, barbarism, and violence. But this is an oversimplified view of a historical era that lasted for over 1,000 years. Many misconceptions about the Middle Ages persist because the era was far richer and more complex than how it's often portrayed in popular culture. A number of widely held beliefs, such as the idea that there was no color, hygiene was non-existent, or that people rarely lived past 30, are based on misunderstandings and myths. In this video, we'll break down some of the most common medieval myths, things many still believe to be true, even though they never were. The myth of the rite of the first night, or jus primae noctis, is commonly associated with the belief that medieval lords had the right to sleep with a serf's bride on her wedding night. This notion lacks historical evidence, although it was widely discussed in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in France. There are no reliable contemporary records that such a custom actually existed in medieval Europe. Some historians believe it may have been more of a symbolic demonstration of lordly power, such as wedding fees or ceremonial gestures, rather than an actual physical practice. Modern research confirms that most references to this supposed practice come from later periods and were often used to portray earlier times as brutal and primitive. Another theory suggests that the rite of the first night was a literary or cultural construct used in political and social critique. For example, Enlightenment writers used the idea to criticize feudalism and highlight the oppression of the lower classes. While similar rituals connected to marriage did exist in other cultures, there is no credible evidence that European lords had any legitimate claim to their peasants' brides. The belief that people in the Middle Ages typically died around the age of 30 comes from a misunderstanding of demographic statistics. While the average life expectancy was indeed around 30 to 35 years, this figure is heavily skewed by extremely high child mortality rates, with 25 to 40% of children dying before age 5. In addition, medieval Europe was frequently struck by devastating diseases such as the plague or smallpox. However, those who survived childhood and adolescence often lived much longer. Once individuals made it past the riskiest stages of life, it was not uncommon for them to live into their 50s, 60s, or 70s. Archaeological studies, including skeletal remains, show that some individuals lived well into their 80s. The idea of chastity belts being used in the Middle Ages to guarantee women's fidelity is, at its core, a myth. Historical evidence indicates that chastity belts were not used during the medieval period, but rather originated from Renaissance satire and jokes that mocked male anxiety over female infidelity. The first mention of anything resembling a chastity belt comes from the manuscript Bellefortis by German military engineer Konrad Kieser in the early 15th century. The manuscript was full of designs for military machines, as well as humorous inventions, including chastity belts, which Kaiser presented as a joke aimed at Florentine women. He clearly did not intend the concept to be taken seriously. The physical chastity belts that exist in museums mostly date from the 18th and 19th centuries, as confirmed by material analyses. These belts were often created as curiosities or satirical props, used to mock so-called barbaric medieval practices. Furthermore, wearing such a device would have been not only painful, but also dangerous to one's health due to hygienic and medical risks. The myth that plague doctors wore iconic beaked masks during the Middle Ages is inaccurate. The costume most associated with the Black Death of the 14th century actually did not appear until the 17th century. This specialized protective outfit was likely designed by French physician Charles Delorme to shield doctors during plague outbreaks, particularly in northern Italy and France. The beaked mask was filled with herbs, flowers, or vinegar-soaked cloth, meant to neutralize miasmas, bad smells believed to transmit disease. Other elements of the outfit included a wax cloak, leather gloves, hat, and boots, all intended to protect against contact with the infected. While the outfit may have provided some barrier protection against droplets or bodily fluids, it was ineffective against the actual bacteria, Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas. Even in their own time, plague doctors were controversial figures. Their ineffective treatments and bizarre appearance made them the target of satire, a reputation that has endured to this day. The portrayal of the Middle Ages in films and TV shows, where clothing is mostly grey or brown, is highly misleading and does not reflect historical reality. Historical evidence shows that medieval clothing was much more colourful. Medieval textiles came in a wide range of colours, with the most popular being red, green, blue, yellow, and their various shades. Colours were obtained from natural sources such as plants, tree bark, fruits, and insects. For example, blue was made from woad, or later by indigo, and red from madder root, or cochineal insects. Colours in clothing also reflected social status. Bright and saturated tones like purple or deep blue were expensive and reserved for the wealthy, while the poor wore more muted hues. The grey and brown tones often seen in medieval movies are used mainly to emphasise a dark and gritty atmosphere. In some regions, prostitutes were required to wear yellow hoods or other yellow clothing to signify their profession. Other parts of Europe used different identifiers, such as striped clothing, headbands, or bells. Yellow dye was cheap due to the availability of materials, which contributed to its association with lower social classes. Black dye, on the other hand, was harder to produce, but it did exist. Natural dyes from oak galls or walnut husks were used to achieve darker shades. Black clothing was expensive and faded quickly, which limited its use among the general population. Medieval clothing was always layered. A linen undergarment was worn beneath a tunic or dress, and then topped with a cloak or coat. This was both for climate reasons, as the Little Ice Age brought cooler temperatures, and social norms, which prohibited public exposure of the body. Medieval people usually wore only one belt and carried 1 or 2 pouches. Most people didn't travel far from home, so they didn't need to carry many items. Warriors were the exception, often using multiple belts for weapons and supplies. Although the myth of Vikings wearing horned helmets is widespread and popular, it has no historical basis. Vikings did not wear horned helmets in battle. Such a design would have been highly impractical. The horns could be easily grabbed or used against the wearer. The only complete Viking helmet ever found, known as the Hjermundbu helmet, has a simple design with a nose guard, but no horns. The myth originates from the 19th century, when costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created horned helmets for Richard Wagner's opera The Ring of the Nibelung in 1876. The design was intended to look dramatic and theatrical, which contributed to the spread of the false image in popular culture. The myth persisted thanks to films, TV shows, and illustrations, but archaeological and historical evidence shows that horns may have been used only for ritual or ceremonial purposes in the early Iron Age, not in battle. The myth that people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat is entirely unfounded and has been debunked by historians. In fact, most medieval scholars accepted the Earth's roundness, a belief inherited from ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Ptolemy. The spherical Earth was even part of the standard university curriculum at the time. One example is the work of al-Biruni, a renowned Muslim scholar, 973 to 1048, who calculated the Earth's radius at 6,339.6 kilometers, incredibly close to the actual value. He also believed the Earth rotated and orbited the Sun. The myth about medieval flat Earth belief didn't emerge until the 19th century, popularized by Washington Irving, who wrote a fictionalized biography, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1828. Irving falsely claimed that church authorities opposed Columbus's voyage because they believed the Earth was flat, a story with no historical backing, likely reflecting Irving's own anti-church views. Later authors such as John Draper and Andrew White expanded the myth in works about the alleged conflict between science and religion, portraying the Middle Ages as a dark age of ignorance. Ironically, some people today believe the Earth is flat. The idea that witch hunts were common in the Middle Ages is a misconception based on later fears and reinterpretations of witchcraft. Witch trials and executions were much more frequent in the early modern period, especially between the 16th and 18th centuries. Until the 13th century, belief in witches and their powers was generally viewed as superstition, not a serious threat. The Christian Church opposed belief in witchcraft, often declaring that supernatural phenomena were illusions or deceptions, and considered heresy, not witchcraft, to be the true danger. The first recorded witch trials began in the 14th century, but they were sporadic and far less brutal than what came later. These trials mostly focused on individuals accused of demonic activity, but were limited in scale and severity. The book, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by Dominican Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, became a major influence on early modern witch hunts. It claimed that witchcraft was a real and urgent threat, and offered instructions for detecting and punishing witches. The book gained widespread use only in the 16th century, during the height of witch hysteria across Europe. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, mass witch trials led to the execution of an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people, mostly women, in Europe and North America. The worst violence occurred in regions with religious conflicts, like Germany and Switzerland. Countries like England and France saw fewer trials. Paradoxically, although belief in witchcraft may seem outdated, it still exists in parts of the world today. In some developing countries, human rights organizations report cases of violence against women and elderly people accused of practicing witchcraft. The idea that medieval battles were nothing more than chaotic brawls with no structure is a myth often reinforced by popular culture, especially films and TV shows. In reality, medieval warfare was far more organized and strategic. Tactics, formations, and planning played a crucial role in battles, as did preparations for prolonged sieges. Medieval armies were often arranged in specific formations, such as the shield wall, where lines of soldiers formed a barrier with interlocked shields to prevent enemy breakthroughs. Another common formation, whose foundations were laid in the High Middle Ages, and which gained importance especially in the Late Middle Ages and early modern period, was the infantry square armed with long spears, highly effective against cavalry charges. Archers and crossbowmen used coordinated volleys to break enemy formations, while cavalry units employed tactics like direct charges or feigned retreats to lure opponents into traps. Large-scale battles, like those seen in films, were actually less common. Conflict more often occurred through raids, skirmishes, or diplomatic maneuvering. Major engagements, like the Battle of Agincourt or Hastings, were relatively rare and typically followed lengthy planning. It is said that Pope Gregory IX, between 1233 and 1234, declared cats to be demonic creatures, supposedly leading to mass killings of cats. This belief is based on the papal bull Vox in Rama, issued in 1233, which referenced an association between black cats and satanic rituals. This may have contributed to negative attitudes toward cats among medieval Christians. Some theories suggest that this disdain for cats may have worsened the spread of the plague, as fewer cats meant fewer predators for rats, the main carriers of the disease. However, this link between Vox in Rama and the Black Death remains controversial, as no direct evidence exists that Gregory IX explicitly ordered mass cat killings. The bull mainly described supposed satanic practices involving cat symbolism, not a command to kill them. Any resulting persecution of cats was likely the result of cultural interpretation, not papal decree. During the witch hunts, cats, especially black ones, were commonly associated with witchcraft, and this negative image persisted long after Gregory IX's papacy. Medieval hygiene and bathing habits were much more advanced than many assume today. Contrary to the myth of filthy, smelly people, cleanliness was seen as important, both practically and spiritually. This attitude declined in later periods, such as the Renaissance and early modern era. Public bathhouses were common in European towns, especially from the 12th century onward. Paris, for example, had as many as 26 public baths. Bathing often included steam rooms, similar to modern saunas, and prices were low enough for even the poor. In some cases, local authorities allowed free access to the poor in exchange for services like providing firewood. The wealthy had private baths with wooden tubs and heated water. Poorer people used basins or washcloths for basic hygiene, including regularly washing their hands and face, especially before meals. Soap made from olive oil or animal fat was available, with its use spreading thanks to Islamic influence and Crusader contact. Perfumes and scented oils were also popular, especially among the upper classes. Both Christian and Islamic traditions emphasize cleanliness as part of both physical and spiritual well-being. Islamic customs like daily washing introduced advanced soap making and perfume techniques to Europe. In the Renaissance and early modern periods, bathing declined due to fears of disease like syphilis and false beliefs that water could enter the body through pores and cause illness. Many infamous medieval torture devices, like the Iron Maiden, Pair of Anguish, or Breast Ripper, were either invented later or entirely fictional. The myth of widespread use of such devices spread in the 18th and 19th centuries, when modern society sought to portray the Middle Ages as barbaric and cruel. The Iron Maiden, supposedly a metal cabinet with spikes inside, was not used in the Middle Ages. The famous Iron Maiden on display in a Vienna museum was actually constructed in the 19th century for exhibitions. The Pair of Anguish, allegedly used for inserting into body orifices and expanding, was more likely a device for stretching clothing like socks. There is no evidence it was used for torture in medieval times. The Breast Ripper, another notorious example, appears in records only from the 16th and 17th centuries, after the medieval era. Many of these devices were museum curiosities, intended to shock visitors rather than represent accurate history. Actual torture in the Middle Ages was often much simpler, typically involving ropes for tying or stretching the accused. Elaborate mechanical contraptions were rarely used, if at all. The image of vast torture chambers filled with horrifying instruments is more of a 19th century fantasy than medieval reality. Chivalry emerged in the 11th century within the feudal system, encompassing ideals like loyalty to one's lord, military skill, and protection of the weak. Over time, it expanded to include social and moral values such as generosity, compassion, and respect. 12th and 13th century literature idealized chivalry, often focusing on courtly love, a romanticized, usually platonic relationship between knight and noblewoman that was meant to inspire heroic deeds. However, in reality, knights were often criticized for violent behavior, looting, or pillaging. The chivalric code primarily applied to the nobility and rarely benefited commoners. Moreover, knights didn't always follow religious principles and often acted on personal moral codes. The image of the virtuous protector of women and the weak was largely shaped by later literature and royal propaganda, which aimed to improve the image of warriors. In practice, knights were warriors fulfilling military duties, and their adherence to chivalric ideals varied widely. Thus, chivalry was more of an ideal than a universal standard, but it still had a significant impact on medieval society and our modern perception of knights. The idea that the medieval church was purely evil is an oversimplification and historically inaccurate. While literature, films, and games often depict clergy as villains, the reality of the medieval Catholic Church was far more complex. The Church had a profound influence on society, not only spiritually, but also politically and economically, and many of its members were devoted to their faith and genuinely worked to improve people's lives. The Church was one of the few institutions that transcended the borders of kingdoms and had a cosmopolitan character. Clergy and scholars from various nations communicated in Latin, which helped facilitate the exchange of ideas and contributed to a shared European culture. However, it's also true that the Church faced corruption and abuses of power. Some popes, archbishops, and bishops embraced luxurious lifestyles and plotted for personal gain at the expense of believers. These failures led to calls for reform, eventually contributing to the Protestant Reformation. Nonetheless, most monks and priests remained faithful to their mission, playing key roles in education, healthcare, and aid to the poor. The myth that religious dogma in the Middle Ages suppressed all independent thought is misleading and incorrect. Although the medieval church promoted unity of faith and was intolerant of heresy, it was not a monolithic system that eliminated intellectual diversity. On the contrary, medieval universities were centers of deep philosophical and theological debate. Critical thinking was encouraged in discussions about the nature of God, the relationship between faith and reason, and many other philosophical questions. A wide range of religious practices existed, often combining Christian elements with folk traditions. Amulets, talismans, and other items were commonly used as protective charms and weren't always condemned by the church if they were seen as natural magic, such as using herbs or stones believed to have God-given properties. The distinction between magic and religion was not as strict as it may seem. Some practices that might now be considered magical were integrated into Christian tradition, like healing amulets with engraved Christian symbols. Period theologians like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas warned against abuse of such practices, especially if they involved incantations or unclear symbols associated with demonic forces. Stories of kings dying on the toilet are fascinating and often amusing, but many are legends rather than confirmed facts. One example is King Edmund Ironside of England, who died in 1016. According to some medieval chroniclers, particularly Henry of Huntingdon, he was murdered on the toilet by an assassin hiding in a latrine shaft. However, this story is debated, and some historians believe he died from battlefield injuries. Another often cited case is King John of England, who died in 1216, likely from dysentery, a common illness due to poor hygiene. There's no evidence he died on a toilet, but the illness was certainly related to digestive issues. King Henry I of England is said to have died in 1135 after eating too many lampreys, which allegedly led to food poisoning or stomach problems. Again, no direct connection to a toilet. The only king known to have definitively died on the toilet was George II of Britain, who died in 1760. According to medical records, his aorta ruptured during a bowel movement, and he was found collapsed next to the toilet. We can't end this section without mentioning Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones, who was shot with a crossbow by his own son Tyrion while on the toilet. It's likely that some of these historical rumors inspired George R.R. Martin's dramatic scene. The idea that medieval scholars debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin is a modern myth with no basis in actual medieval texts. This notion originated in the 17th century as a satirical jab at scholastic theology. During that period, scholasticism was often mocked for being overly speculative, and questions like this were used to illustrate its alleged absurdity. There are no known medieval texts that raise this question. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas were more concerned with the nature of angels, such as their incorporeality and ability to act in space, but not their number on a pinhead. The legend spread later through satirical works, particularly in the 19th century, as a way to ridicule medieval scholarship. The claim that people in the Middle Ages drank beer and wine instead of water because water was too dirty is not entirely accurate. While it's true that urban water sources were often contaminated, many people still drank fresh water from wells, springs, and rivers, which were considered safe. Beer and wine were popular because fermentation made them safer than some polluted water, and they had nutritional value, especially beer. Medieval beer and wine typically had lower alcohol content than modern versions. They were consumed often, but not necessarily in preference to water. In rural areas, drinking water remained common. Scientific research suggests that medieval people didn't rely exclusively on alcohol for hydration. Water was still a major part of daily life, particularly outside cities. The idea that childhood didn't exist in the Middle Ages is a misconception, largely stemming from the work of historian Philippe Ariès in the 1960s. Ariès argued that children were seen as miniature adults, receiving no special treatment or recognition of their unique needs. However, more recent research has disproven this view. Archaeological finds of toys, such as dolls, tin soldiers, clay marbles, and wooden horses, show that medieval society did recognize children as a distinct group with their own needs and joys. There were schools in the Middle Ages, and even textbooks specifically for children, such as the Promptorium Parvulorum, a Latin-English dictionary designed for young learners. There were also legal norms that acknowledged special protections for children, including bans on child labor in certain areas and provisions for the care of orphans. In illuminated manuscripts and medieval sculpture, scenes depicting children at play or in educational settings are relatively common. Historians like Nicholas Orme have pointed out that Ariès' perspective was shaped by the lack of archaeological and iconographic evidence available in his time. And that's it for our selection of myths and legends about the Middle Ages. What surprised you the most? Do you have any other myths or questions in mind? Let us know in the comments.